The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The neighborhood was quiet, just like any other evening. Kids had already gone inside after playing outside all day, and the streets were empty except for a few cars passing by. It was one of those peaceful moments where everything seemed perfect. On the porch of a small house sat a teenage girl, sipping her iced tea while scrolling through her phone. She looked relaxed, enjoying the cool breeze that came with the end of the day. Her mom was inside baking cookies for an upcoming community event, and life felt simple, almost too good to be true. But sometimes even the calmest days can take a sudden turn. The sound of tires screeching broke the silence as two police cars pulled up abruptly in front of the house. The girl froze, her fingers pausing mid-scroll on her phone. She looked up, confused. Why were cops here? Had something happened nearby? Before she could process what was going on, two officers stepped out of their vehicles and walked briskly toward her driveway. One of them called out, "We're looking into reports of vandalism in this area. We need to search your property." His tone was sharp, leaving no room for questions. The girl blinked, startled. Vandalism? That didn't make sense. Her family hadn't done anything wrong. They weren't the kind of people who got into trouble. They were regular folks trying to live peacefully. She tried to stay calm and explain herself. "I don't think there's been any vandalism here," she said softly, standing up from her chair. "My mom and I have been home all afternoon." But instead of listening, the officers exchanged looks and started talking over her. One of them raised his voice, accusing her of being uncooperative. The girl's heart began to race. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Weren't they supposed to protect people? Why did they seem so angry? Before she could say anything else, one of the officers grabbed her arm tightly. Pain shot through her shoulder as he twisted it behind her back. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she bit her lip, refusing to let them fall. "You're resisting," the officer barked, his grip tightening even more. Resisting? How could she resist when she hadn't done anything wrong? Panic bubbled inside her chest. She wanted to scream for help, to call out to her parents, but fear choked her words. All she could do was stand there, trembling, wondering why this was happening. Inside the house, her dad was putting away groceries after returning from a quick trip to the store. He hadn't noticed the commotion yet, but something about the energy outside caught his attention. Maybe it was the tension in the air or the faint sound of raised voices. Whatever it was, it made him stop what he was doing and head toward the door. When he opened it, the scene hit him like a punch to the gut. There was his daughter, his little girl, being held roughly by a man in uniform. Another officer stood close by, shouting orders that only added to the chaos. For a moment, time stood still. Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward. His presence alone changed the atmosphere. Standing tall, with broad shoulders and a commanding demeanor, he wasn't someone you could ignore easily. Years of training in special forces had taught him how to handle high-pressure situations, and right now every ounce of that experience kicked in. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. The officers turned, surprised by his sudden appearance. One of them tried to assert authority, but the man cut him off before he could finish. "That's my daughter," he said, pointing at the terrified girl. "And you're hurting her." The tension thickened as everyone processed the weight of his words. The girl locked eyes with her father, relief washing over her face despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. Finally, someone was here to help her, someone who wouldn't back down. As the standoff continued, the man kept his composure, speaking clearly and deliberately. He demanded answers, refusing to let the officers brush him off. Every word he spoke carried authority, backed by years of discipline and leadership. And though the situation was far from resolved, one thing became clear. Things were about to change, for better or worse. The man standing in the doorway wasn't just any father. He was someone who had spent years training for moments like this, moments where calm thinking and decisive action mattered most. His time in special forces had taught him how to stay composed under pressure, how to read a situation quickly, and how to take control without losing his cool. But today, This wasn't about tactics or strategies. This was personal. This was about protecting his child. When he stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanned everything. The way one officer held his daughter's arm too tightly, the other hovering nearby with an aggressive stance, the look of fear on her face. Every detail registered in his mind instantly. His jaw tightened as he assessed the situation, but he didn't let anger show. Instead, he spoke again, his voice steady and clear. "I asked you a question," he said, addressing the officers directly. "What's going on here? Why is my daughter being treated this way?" One of the officers hesitated for a split second before replying. "We're investigating vandalism in the area," he said, trying to sound authoritative. "She wasn't cooperating." The man raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Cooperating? She's 16 years old, standing on her own porch. How exactly? Was she not cooperating?" His tone wasn't loud, but there was something about it that demanded respect. It wasn't just the words he used, it was the way he carried himself. Years of leading teams in high-stakes situations had given him a presence that commanded attention. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing they were dealing with someone who wouldn't back down easily. "Sir, I need you to step back and let us do our job," one of them said, though his voice lacked conviction now. The man shook his head slightly, his expression firm. "Your job is to protect people, not harass them. If you have a reason to be here, fine. But if not, then release my daughter right now." For a moment, no one moved. The tension hung heavy in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, slowly, the officer holding the girl loosened his grip. She stumbled forward slightly, rubbing her sore arm, tears still streaming down her face. Her father immediately stepped closer, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything to her yet. He kept his focus on the officers. But his touch reassured her that she wasn't alone anymore. Seeing the shift in dynamics, the second officer tried to regain control of the situation. "Look, we're just doing our duty," he said defensively. "If you interfere, things could get worse." The man arched an eyebrow again, almost amused at the threat. "Worse for whom?" he asked calmly. "Because if you think I'm going to stand here and watch while you intimidate a child, you're mistaken." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With deliberate movements, he turned on the camera and began recording. "Let's make sure we document this properly," he said, his voice carrying a hint of warning. "Just in case anyone forgets what happened here today." The officers looked uneasy, shifting their weight from foot to foot. They weren't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone who seemed so prepared. One of them muttered something under his breath, but the man ignored it. He wasn't interested in arguments or excuses. All he cared about was making sure his daughter was safe, and ensuring that these men understood they couldn't bully their way through this. As the standoff continued, the girl wiped her tears with the back of her hand, watching her father handle the situation. Despite everything, she felt a flicker of relief. Growing up, she'd always admired how strong and capable he was, but seeing him in action now made her realize just how much he'd been holding back all these years. This wasn't just a dad stepping in to defend his kid. It was a leader taking charge when it mattered most. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the officers sighed and took a step back. "Fine," he said gruffly. "We'll leave, for now, but don't think this is over." The man nodded once, his expression unreadable. "It's over when I say it's over," he replied evenly. "And trust me, we'll be discussing this further." With that, the officers returned to their cars and drove off, leaving behind a cloud of dust and unanswered questions. For a few seconds, the only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then the man turned to his daughter, his stern demeanor melting away as concern filled his eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, placing both hands on her shoulders. "Did they hurt you?" She nodded, still sniffling. "I'm fine, I think, just scared." He pulled her into a hug, holding her close. "You don't have to be scared anymore," he whispered. "I'm here now. Nothing's going to happen to you." For a while they stayed like that, father and daughter, drawing strength from each other. But even as the immediate danger passed, the man knew this wasn't the end. Something bigger was at stake here. not just for his family but for everyone who might find themselves in a similar situation someday, and he wasn't about to let it slide. Later that evening, as the house grew quiet, the man sat at the kitchen table reviewing the video he'd recorded earlier. His wife brought him a cup of coffee, setting it down gently beside him. "What are you planning to do?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with worry. He glanced up at her, his expression resolute. "Whatever it takes," he said simply. "This isn't just about us. It's about accountability. If we don't stand up now, who will?" His wife nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Together they began discussing their next steps, how to file a complaint, who to contact, and how to ensure that justice was served. It wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't happen overnight. But one thing was clear: they were ready to fight for what was right. Meanwhile, upstairs, the girl lay on her bed staring at the ceiling. Her heart still raced whenever she thought about the officers' faces, their harsh voices, the way they'd treated her like a criminal. But she also thought about her father, how he'd walked in like a storm, calm but unstoppable, refusing to let anyone push him around. She realized then that bravery wasn't about never feeling afraid. It was about facing your fears head-on, no matter how hard it was. As sleep finally claimed her, she clung to that realization, hoping it would give her the courage to keep moving forward. Because tomorrow was a new day, and she knew her family would face it together, stronger than ever. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up to whispers. People peeked out of their windows or gathered on sidewalks, talking in hushed tones about what had happened the night before. Word spread quickly. 2 police officers had shown up at a local family's home. Things got heated, and the father had stepped in to protect his daughter. Some folks sided with the officers, saying they were just doing their job. Others shook their heads, muttering about how something didn't seem right. For the girl and her family, though, there was no time to dwell on gossip. They had bigger things to focus on. After breakfast, the father sat everyone down at the kitchen table. His wife poured coffee for herself and tea for the girl, who still looked pale and shaken. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his expression serious but calm. "Listen," he began, looking at each of them in turn. "What happened last night wasn't okay. Those officers crossed a line, and we can't let that slide. If we don't speak up now, nothing will change." The girl nodded slowly, clutching her mug tightly. She wanted to believe everything would be fine, but deep down she couldn't shake the fear that this might not end well. What if the officers came back? What if people judged her family for standing up? Her mind raced with questions, but she stayed quiet, listening to her father. Her mother reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over hers. "We're in this together," she said softly. "No matter what happens, we'll face it, as a team." The father pulled out a notebook and started jotting down notes. He'd already done some research online late into the night, learning about filing complaints against law enforcement and reaching out to organizations that specialized in cases like theirs. He explained everything step by step, making sure both his wife and daughter understood what needed to happen next. "We need evidence," he said firmly. "That video I recorded is a start, but we should gather more. Any witness statements, photos, anything that can help build our case. And we'll need to talk to a lawyer who knows how to handle situations like this." The girl perked up slightly at the mention of witnesses. "Mrs. Carter from next door saw part of what happened," she said hesitantly. "She was watering her plants when the officers first arrived. Maybe she could tell us something?" Her father smiled faintly, proud of her for thinking ahead. "Good idea. Let's go talk to her later today." Later that afternoon, the 3 of them walked over to Mrs. Carter's house. The elderly woman greeted them warmly, inviting them inside despite the tension hanging in the air. Over cups of lemonade, they explained what had happened and asked if she'd seen anything unusual. "Well, I did notice those officers acting rather aggressively," Mrs. Carter admitted, frowning thoughtfully. "I didn't hear everything they said, but it seemed excessive, especially for such a young girl." Her words gave them hope. With her permission, the father recorded a brief statement from her, thanking her profusely for her support. As They left her house. The girl felt a small spark of confidence returning. Maybe they weren't alone in this after all. Back home, the father spent hours on the phone calling lawyers and advocacy groups. Each conversation left him more determined than before. One attorney in particular stood out, a man named Mr. Thompson who had years of experience fighting for justice in similar cases. During their call, Mr. Thompson listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions and offering practical advice. "This isn't going to be easy," he warned. "But if you're willing to fight, I'm willing to help." By the end of the day, the family had a plan. They would file a formal complaint with the police department, submit the video and witness statements as evidence, and work closely with Mr. Thompson to ensure their voices were heard. It was daunting, but they knew they couldn't give up, not when so much was at stake. As days turned into weeks, the story gained traction beyond their small neighborhood. Someone had shared the video online, and soon it went viral. Social media feeds lit up with posts about the incident, sparking debates about policing practices and racial profiling. For the girl, the sudden attention was overwhelming. At school, classmates either avoided her completely or bombarded her with questions she didn't know how to answer. One day during lunch, a group of kids cornered her near the lockers. "Is it true?" one of them asked bluntly. "Did your dad really stand up to the cops?" The girl hesitated, unsure how to respond. She didn't want to relive the moment, but she also didn't want to stay silent. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. "Yeah, it's true," she said quietly. "They treated me like I'd done something wrong, even though I hadn't. My dad just stepped in to protect me." Some of the kids nodded sympathetically, while others muttered under their breath. A few even accused her of exaggerating the story, claiming the officers must have had a good reason for their actions. Hurt and frustrated, the girl retreated to the library, where she found solace in writing poetry. Pouring her emotions onto paper became her way of coping, a private space where she could process everything without judgment. At home, her parents noticed the toll it was taking on her. Her mother suggested therapy, gently reminding her that it was okay to ask for help. Reluctantly, the girl agreed, and the sessions proved to be a lifeline. Talking to someone outside the situation helped her untangle her feelings and regain a sense of control. Meanwhile, the legal battle dragged on. Depositions were scheduled, evidence reviewed, and tensions ran high. The father attended every meeting, every hearing, armed with folders full of notes and documents. His military background served him well. He approached each step methodically, ensuring nothing was overlooked. Still, the process was exhausting, and there were moments when doubt crept in. Late one evening, as he sat at the kitchen table reviewing files, his wife placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You're doing everything you can," she said softly. "That's all anyone can ask for." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I just wish it didn't have to be this hard." She squeezed his hand. "不用担心，我会继续完成这个请求。"以下是第三部分的扩展内容。Despite the challenges, the family refused to give up. Their determination inspired others in the community to rally around them. Neighbors organized meetings to discuss policing reform, and local activists joined forces to amplify their voices. Even strangers reached out, sending messages of encouragement and sharing their own stories of injustice. For the girl, seeing this wave of support was bittersweet. On one hand, it reminded her that they weren't fighting alone. On the other hand, it highlighted just how widespread the problem was. How many others had faced similar situations, but never had the chance to speak out. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, the father turned off the news and looked at his daughter. "You know," he said, his voice soft but firm, "this isn't just about us anymore. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what you did." She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and resolve. "I want that too," she whispered. "But sometimes it feels impossible." He smiled faintly, leaning forward to rest his elbows on his knees. "Change always feels impossible until it happens. But it starts with people like us refusing to stay silent." His words, lingered in the air, planting a seed of hope in her heart. For the first time since the ordeal began, she allowed herself to imagine a future where things were different. Not perfect, but better. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew one thing for sure. As long as her family stood together, they could face whatever came their way. The weeks turned into months, and the family found themselves caught in a whirlwind of emotions: hope, frustration, anger, and exhaustion. Every day brought new developments, some promising, others disheartening. But through it all, they held on to one another, drawing strength from their shared determination to see this fight through. One chilly morning, the father sat at the kitchen table sipping his coffee while flipping through a thick stack of documents. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of papers. He had spent countless hours reviewing legal briefs, deposition transcripts, and witness statements. His eyes were tired, but his resolve hadn't wavered. If anything, it had grown stronger with each passing day. His wife walked in, tying her robe around her waist as she glanced at him. "Still at it?" she asked softly, pouring herself a cup of tea. He nodded, leaning back in his chair with a sigh. "There's so much to go over. I don't want to miss anything that could help us." She placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You're doing everything you can," she reminded him. "That's all anyone can ask for." Her words were meant to comfort, but he couldn't shake the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. This wasn't just about winning a case, it was about proving a point, that accountability mattered, that no one was above the law, and that families like theirs deserved justice. At school, the girl tried to focus on her studies, but it was hard. The incident lingered in her mind, replaying itself over and over like a broken record. Some days she felt strong enough to brush it off. Other days, even the smallest things, a police car driving by, a stern teacher raising their voice, sent her spiraling back to that night on the porch. Her poetry became an outlet, a way to process her feelings without having to explain them out loud. She filled notebooks with verses about fear, resilience, and hope, her handwriting messy but heartfelt. One poem titled Courage stood out among the rest. Courage isn't standing tall when the world cheers you on. It's finding your feet when the ground feels shaky. It's speaking up when silence seems easier, and it's holding on when letting go feels safer. When her English teacher assigned the class to write something personal, she hesitated before deciding to share the poem. As she read it aloud, her voice trembled at first but grew steadier with each line. By the end, the room was silent, her classmates looking at her with a mix of admiration and understanding. After class, a few students approached her, offering kind words. "I didn't realize how tough it must have been for you," one of them said sincerely. "You're really brave." Brave. The word echoed in her mind long after the bell rang. Was she brave? She didn't always feel like it. Most days, she felt scared and unsure, like she was walking a tightrope without a safety net. But maybe bravery wasn't about feeling fearless. It was about moving forward despite the fear. Back at home, the legal battle continued to unfold. Depositions were scheduled, and the family prepared tirelessly for each session. The father drilled his daughter on what to expect, making sure she felt ready to answer questions truthfully and confidently. He knew the officer's lawyers would try to twist her words, painting her as uncooperative or disrespectful. But he also knew she had nothing to hide, and neither did he. On the day of the first deposition, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Reporters crowded outside, cameras flashing as the family made their way inside. The girl clutched her father's arm, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mother walked beside them, her presence calm but resolute. Inside, the atmosphere was formal and intimidating. Lawyers shuffled papers, and the judge listened intently as opening statements were made. When it was the girl's turn to speak, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her father gave her an encouraging nod, mouthing the words, "You've got this." As she recounted the events of that night, her voice remained steady, though her hands trembled slightly. She described the officer's arrival, their accusations, and the way they'd treated her. Each word felt heavy, like lifting a weight, but she pushed through, determined to tell her truth. The opposing counsel fired questions at her, trying to poke holes in her story. "Isn't it true," he began, his tone sharp, "that you refused to cooperate with the officers?" She paused, glancing at her father before answering. "I didn't refuse to cooperate," she said firmly. "I told them I hadn't done anything wrong. They didn't listen." Her response silenced the room momentarily, and she felt a flicker of pride. For once, she wasn't shrinking under scrutiny. She was standing her ground. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy intensified. News outlets covered every detail of the case, sparking heated debates across social media. Supporters rallied behind the family, organizing protests and petitions demanding accountability. Critics dismissed the story as exaggerated, accusing the family of playing the victim. Through it all, the girl struggled to navigate the spotlight. At times, she felt empowered, knowing her voice was being heard. Other times, she felt overwhelmed, wishing she could retreat into anonymity. Her parents shielded her as much as possible, reminding her that she didn't owe anyone explanations beyond what she was comfortable sharing. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, the family gathered in the living room. The TV was off and the house was eerily quiet. The father leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "No matter what happens next," he said, looking at his wife and daughter, "we've already won in one way." "How do you mean?" the girl asked, her brow furrowing. "We've shown people that it's possible to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. We've started conversations that need to happen, and we've proven that we're stronger together than we are apart." His words resonated deeply, filling the room with a sense of purpose. They weren't naive enough to believe the system would change overnight, but they understood that progress often began with small, courageous steps. As the case dragged on, the community rallied around them in unexpected ways. Neighbors organized fundraisers to cover legal fees. Local businesses donated supplies, and strangers sent letters of encouragement. Even Mrs. Carter, the elderly woman who had witnessed part of the incident, showed up at one of the hearings, holding a sign that "Radiant justice starts with accountability." For the girl, these acts of kindness reminded her that they weren't alone. Though the journey was far from over, she began to see glimpses of light breaking through the darkness. Change might not come quickly, but it was coming, and she intended to be part of it. By the time the final hearing approached, the family was exhausted but hopeful. They had poured everything into this fight, not just for themselves, but for everyone who deserved to feel safe in their own home. Whatever the outcome, they knew they had done everything in their power to make a difference, and sometimes that was enough. The day of the final hearing arrived, and the air felt heavy with anticipation. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, supporters holding signs, reporters jockeying for position, and curious onlookers hoping to catch a glimpse of the family at the center of the storm. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but hushed, as if everyone collectively understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. The girl sat between her parents in the front row, her hands clasped tightly together. She wore a simple dress her mother had picked out, its soft fabric offering little comfort against the knots twisting in her stomach. Her father leaned over slightly, whispering reassurances. "You've done everything right," he said softly. "Just breathe. We're here with you." She nodded, though her heart raced like a drumbeat she couldn't silence. The courtroom itself seemed impossibly large, with high ceilings and wooden benches that creaked under the weight of so many people. Lawyers bustled around, stacking papers and adjusting ties, while the judge presided over it all with an expressionless face. When the proceedings began, the room fell silent except for the rhythmic tapping of the gavel. Each side presented their arguments, the prosecution laying out evidence of misconduct, the defense arguing that the officers had acted within their rights. The girl listened intently, her eyes fixed forward, though every word felt like a punch to the gut. At one point, the opposing counsel stood up, his voice booming as he defended the officers' actions. "These men were simply doing their duty," he declared. "They encountered resistance and responded accordingly." The girl flinched, her grip tightening on the edge of the bench. Resistance? That word again. It made her blood boil, not because of how it sounded, but because of what it implied, that somehow she had provoked this entire ordeal. She glanced at her father, who sat rigidly beside her, his jaw clenched. He caught her eye and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, silently reminding her to stay strong. Finally, it was time for closing statements. The family's lawyer rose from his seat, his presence commanding yet calm. He began by thanking the court before launching into a powerful speech. "This case isn't just about one night or one family," he said, his voice steady but impassioned. "It's about trust, the trust we place in those who swear to protect us. When that trust is broken, it leaves scars that take years to heal." He turned toward the girl, nodding slightly. That young woman sitting there did nothing wrong. She was targeted, intimidated, and treated as guilty until proven innocent. And when her father stepped in to defend her, he wasn't acting out of aggression, he was acting out of love. Love for his daughter, yes, but also love for justice. The room seemed to hold its breath as he continued. "We ask you to consider what message we send when we allow such behavior to go unchecked. Do we tell our children that they are powerless, that their voices don't matter? Or do we stand up and say no more?" His words resonated deeply, not just with the family but with everyone present. Even some of the skeptics in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to ignore the truth behind his argument. When he finished, the judge thanked him, and the courtroom erupted into murmurs before being called back to order. After hours of deliberation, the verdict came down. Both officers were placed on administrative leave pending further investigation, and one was formally charged with excessive use of force. It wasn't the complete victory the family had hoped for. One officer walked away without significant consequences, but it was enough to signal progress. As the judge dismissed the court, the girl let out a shaky breath, tears welling up in her eyes. Her mother pulled her into a tight hug, whispering, "You did it, sweetheart. You stood your ground." Her father remained quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the retreating figures of the officers' legal team. Then, turning to his family, he allowed himself a small smile. "This is just the beginning," he said firmly. "We've shown them we won't back down." Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers as the family emerged from the courthouse. Supporters waved signs and chanted slogans, their voices ringing out with hope and defiance. Reporters swarmed them, shoving microphones in their faces and firing off questions. The father raised a hand, signaling for silence. "Thank you all for standing with us," he began, his voice carrying over the noise. "This fight wasn't easy, and it's far from over. But today we proved that accountability matters. Today we reminded ourselves that change is possible, even if it comes slowly." His words drew applause, and the girl stepped forward hesitantly, encouraged by her parents. Taking a deep breath, she addressed the crowd. "I never wanted any of this to happen," she admitted, her voice trembling but clear. "But now that it has, I'm glad we didn't give up. Because giving up would mean letting fear win. And I refuse to live my life afraid." Her statement brought tears to more than a few eyes, including those of strangers watching online. Social media lit up with reactions, many praising the family's courage and resilience. For the first time in months, the girl felt a flicker of peace, not because the battle was over, but because she knew she'd faced it head-on. Back home, that evening the house felt quieter than usual, almost surreal after the chaos of the past few days. The girl sat cross-legged on the living room floor, flipping through the pages of her poetry notebook. Her mother brought her a cup of hot chocolate, setting it down gently beside her. "How are you feeling?" she asked, sitting across from her. "I don't know," the girl admitted, tracing the rim of the mug with her finger. "Relieved, I guess. But also sad. Like, why does any of this have to happen in the first place?" Her mother sighed, reaching out to pat her knee. "It shouldn't. But sometimes unfair things happen to show us where we need to grow, as individuals, as families, as communities." The girl nodded slowly, absorbing her mother's words. She thought about the people who had supported them, the ones who had doubted them, and even the ones who still refused to see their side. Change wasn't going to come overnight, and not everyone would agree on how to make things better. But she realized something important. It wasn't her job to convince everyone. Her job was to keep speaking her truth no matter how hard it got. Later that night, as the house grew still, the father stood by the window, staring out at the darkened street. His wife joined him, wrapping an arm around his waist. "What are you thinking about?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Everything, nothing, just wondering what's next." She smiled faintly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it. Together." Together. That word carried so much weight, yet it felt lighter somehow, like a promise they'd made to each other long ago. They weren't naive enough to believe the world would suddenly become perfect, but they knew one thing for sure. As long as they kept fighting, not just for themselves but for others, they could make it a little bit better, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Years had passed since that fateful night, and the memory of it still lingered in the girl's mind like a scar, faded, but never fully gone. Life had moved forward, as it always does, but the lessons from that chapter stayed with her, shaping who she was becoming. She wasn't the same shy teenager who had once sat on the porch sipping iced tea, unaware of how quickly her world could change. Now she carried herself differently, with a quiet strength born out of struggle. The courtroom victory hadn't been perfect, but it had sparked something bigger than anyone could have anticipated. The case became a rallying cry for communities across the country, igniting conversations about accountability, trust, and reform. People started paying attention, not just to headlines, but to the stories behind them. And slowly, painfully, progress began to take root. For the girl, the journey wasn't over when the trial ended. If anything, it marked the beginning of a new mission. Inspired by her own experience, she decided to dedicate her life to making a difference. After high school, she enrolled in college, majoring in criminal justice. Her parents watched with pride as she threw herself into her studies, attending lectures, joining advocacy groups, and speaking at rallies whenever she could. Her dad often joked that he'd created a force to be reckoned with, but there was no mistaking the admiration in his voice. He remembered the scared teenager who had once clung to him for protection, and now here she was, standing tall, unafraid to challenge systems that needed fixing. It made him feel like all their hard work had been worth it. One crisp autumn evening, years after the trial, the family gathered in their living room. The TV flickered softly in the background, though no one was really watching. Instead, they were focused on the laptop screen sitting on the coffee table. On it was an email confirming that the girl had been invited to speak at a community forum on policing reform. "You're going to do great," her mom said, smiling warmly as she handed her a cup of tea. "They wouldn't have asked if they didn't think you had something important to say." The girl nodded, though nerves fluttered in her chest. Public speaking wasn't her favorite thing, but she knew this moment mattered. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who might find themselves in a similar situation someday. She owed it to them to share her story. The day of the forum arrived, and the venue buzzed with energy. People filled the rows of chairs, some clutching notebooks, others recording the event on their phones. Activists, law enforcement officials, and ordinary citizens mingled before taking their seats, united by a shared desire for change. When the girl stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, she stood behind the podium, gripping its edges tightly. Her heart raced as she scanned the crowd, searching for familiar faces. There, near the front row, sat her parents. Her dad gave her an encouraging nod, while her mom beamed proudly. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "Good evening," she started, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "When I was 16 years old, my life changed forever because of an encounter with police officers. Some of you may know parts of my story already. What happened that night wasn't fair, and it left scars that will always be with me. But tonight I'm not here to talk about what went wrong. I'm here to talk about what can go right, if we choose to make it so. She paused, letting her words sink in. Then she continued. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to act despite it. That's what my father taught me when he walked onto our porch that night. Not with anger, but with resolve. And that's what I've learned to carry with me ever since. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, weaving together personal anecdotes and broader reflections on the need for accountability. She talked about the importance of listening to victims, to communities, to those willing to admit mistakes. She emphasized the value of empathy, urging law enforcement to see the people they serve not as threats but as human beings deserving of respect. By the time she finished, the audience erupted into applause. Some people stood, cheering loudly, while others wiped away tears. As she stepped down from the stage, strangers approached her to shake her hand or thank her for sharing her story. One elderly woman hugged her tightly, whispering, "You give us hope." After the forum, the family celebrated quietly at home. Her dad grilled burgers in the backyard and her mom set up a small picnic table under the stars. They laughed and reminisced about everything they'd been through, the tough days, the victories, the moments that had brought them closer together. "I'm proud of you," her dad said later, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied grin. "Not just because of tonight, but because of who you've become. You're fearless." The girl smiled, shaking her head slightly. "I don't know about fearless," she admitted. "But I've learned that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you are." Her mom reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "That's exactly what makes you fearless." As the night wore on, the conversation turned reflective. They talked about the future, what challenges lay ahead, and how much work still needed to be done. The girl acknowledged that the road to real change would be long and difficult, but she felt hopeful. For the first time in a long time, she believed that the world could be better. Not perfect, but better. In the years that followed, the girl continued to advocate for reform, using her voice to push for policies that prioritized transparency and fairness. She wrote articles, organized workshops, and partnered with organizations working toward the same goals. Though setbacks came, she faced each one with resilience, knowing that every step forward counted. Her parents remained her biggest supporters, cheering her on from the sidelines. They attended her events, shared her posts online, and reminded her to take breaks when the weight of the fight became too heavy. Together, they proved that a family united by love and purpose could weather anything. Looking back, the girl realized that the hardest moments of her life had also been the ones that defined her. That night on the porch hadn't just been an attack, it had been a catalyst. It had pushed her to grow, to fight, and to believe in the power of standing up for what was right. And though the scars remained, so did the strength she had found within herself. As she stood on another stage years later, addressing yet another crowd, she glanced out at the sea of faces. Somewhere in the audience, her parents sat side by side, smiling up at her. She took a deep breath, feeling grateful for the journey that had brought her here. "This isn't just my story," she told the crowd. "It's ours. Because when we stand together, we remind ourselves and the world that change is possible. All it takes is courage." And with that, she stepped away from the podium, ready to keep moving forward, one step at a time.